Hello and welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Just a pleasant private chat. U.S. President Barack Obama's decision to meet with the Dalai Lama has angered the Chinese. Who is the Dalai Lama? A pious religious leader or a Western conduit to undermine China's security and sovereignty? To discuss the man that stands between China and the U.S., I'm joined by Webster Tarpley in Washington, a journalist, historian, and an author. And in Brussels, we cross to Andrew Liu, an international and independent China specialist, and another member of our CrossTalk team, Yelena Hanga. Webster, I'd like to go to you first. What's the timing all about here? I mean, Obama was in China in November, making the right sounds, working together on a lot of tough issues, and now the Dalai Lama drops in, and the Chinese, well, obviously are not taking it very well. What about the timing? What's it all mean?
I think it's very bad timing. It's obviously a gratuitous insult to China. It's going to cause bilateral friction. This is not good for the world. This is one of the most important bilateral relations that exist. The United States is systematically antagonizing China on about a dozen issues, and this right now is one of the most prominent. And I'm afraid that behind that lurks a kind of hysteria which has broken out in the U.S. ruling elite over the fact that China is probably the world's largest exporter at the present time, having passed Germany. It is neck and neck with Japan as the world's second largest economy. And if we think in terms of real production, as distinct from zombie banks or financial derivatives, it's likely that China is already the biggest industrial economy in the world. So what we have coming in the Wall Street circles and here in Washington is, again, a hysteria. It's a little bit like what the British felt towards Germany before World War I. The idea that there's a challenging power on the scene with tremendous economic dynamism, and what do you do about that? And unfortunately, this feckless, embarrassing response that we're seeing is to play the Taiwan card, the Tibet card, the Xinjiang card, the Google card, and a whole series of other initiatives Webster, that are going to antagonize China but get nowhere.
I hope your analogy to Germany in the beginning of the 20th century is wrong, because we know what happened after that, because the world didn't adopt to an emerging Germany. I'd like to go to Andrew now. The same question. I mean, what about the timing here? I mean, the Chinese obviously didn't want this to happen. They do protest. But, you know, there are so many contentious issues right now. Did the Obama administration make a mistake?
Well, I think that in a way, of course, it is unfortunate, the coincidence of all these issues. But on the other hand, Obama's popularity in the United States seems to be waning. And then, of course, he has to make a position to appear to be stronger against a rising China, as my colleague in Washington was referring to. And also the study, the reference to the past is also relevant in the sense that the Chinese, of course, study the rise of the great powers about a couple of years ago and trying to learn from past experiences and mistakes and problems. And I think that the rise of China, of course, is inevitable. But in this rise, there is a mutual independence. Well, China, of course, is investing in U.S. treasuries, financing the U.S. low interest and their consumers and supplying the U.S. consumers with cheap products. And, of course, China depends on the U.S. technology on a number of fronts, well, including the energy to address climate change and energy efficiency. So it's a great deal of mutual dependence on American side.
Okay,
American needs China's help
I'd like to go back to the Dalai Lama,
Iran
though.
And North Korea.
I'd like to go back to the Dalai Lama. Meeting in the map room, I mean, again, kind of a half measure, meeting with the Dalai Lama, but, you know, not officially. This is a private meeting, quote unquote. Talking to a religious figure, not a political figure. Again, is this a compromise? I mean, he had to meet him, but he's not going to meet him officially. I mean, this is wishy-washy, isn't it?
It certainly is.
I think that is a very, very important message.
Okay, go Andrew first, and then we'll go to Webster. Go ahead.
I think this is a very important message because, I mean, let's face it. I mean, a number of leaders, including more recently, Sarkozy met the Dalai Lama, and in fact, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom met the Dalai Lama in various contexts. But it's the context that is important. Of course, China doesn't deny that there is such a person as Dalai Lama, but of course, the Chinese leadership doesn't trust the Dalai Lama in spite of what he said.
Okay. If I go to Webster now, it's very interesting what Andrew had to say. The trust level here. I mean, what does the Dalai Lama actually want to achieve? I mean, we've seen this before, and I don't see that he's achieved much at all. As a matter of fact, it might be just counterproductive.
There are two sides to it. One is that we have in the United States, especially in Hollywood, a coterie of wealthy mystics who have made the Dalai Lama into a kind of a hobby. On the other hand, though, remember, the United States regards Tibet as an integral part of China. That has never changed. Nobody has ever recognized the Dalai Lama as a government in exile, although he tries to behave as one. And the inherent problem that the Dalai Lama has is he says, I'm a religious leader, but of course he was the head of this regime in Tibet up until about 1959, which was this feudal manorial system where you had, I guess you'd call it Caesaropapism. In other words, the emperor and the pope were the same person, the Dalai Lama, and he was a living god. So now he says, I'm only doing the religious side, not the political side. He has at various times demanded the complete independence of Tibet, which has not really been a reality since about 1600, 1700 or thereabouts. So therefore there is a great mistrust. And generally speaking, he has this past record of having participated in all of these CIA operations.
Well, exactly.
His immediate family.
You preempted me. That's what I wanted to talk about. Andrew, if we can go back to you in Brussels, I mean, why should the Chinese look at the United States as just meeting the Dalai Lama for religious purposes or something like that? I mean, the history of CIA involvement in Tibet is very long. It's very public. It's very well known. And, and this is a good reason why the Chinese are upset, and they have a good reason to be, I would say.
Well, obviously, but the reality is that Dalai Lama is an international icon. He's a Nobel Prize laureate, and obviously he's received quite favorably by the world's leaders. And I was referring to the internal politics in America. So all these realities have got to be taken into account. But China is now in a dilemma. Of course, as I said, I mean, China doesn't trust the Dalai Lama in spite of what he says. And also, China puts a lot of energy resources in building up the standard of living of the Tibetan people. I mean, you talk about religion. I mean, religion is not forbidden. I mean, the religion is allowed to be practiced. And also, the standard of living is rising quite rapidly, according to the United Nations development indexes. But in spite of that, there is a huge influx of the Han Chinese there, and it causes a lot of problems. So I think China needs to manage this quite rapid transition economically. And also, the Tibetans, compared with the Han Chinese, they are less able to compete in this kind of open economy. So that question has got to be addressed. But there is no question that is a very huge question for China. It's not just Tibet, because it could be the start of a domino affecting provinces like Xinjiang. And even Tibet is a huge province. And apart from the size, it's also the source of fresh water supply, a source of minerals and energy supplies routes. So it's a lot of strategic interest for China. But China needs to manage this very, very carefully. And of course, it's a very, very sensitive point for China.
Webster, if I can go to you, has the Hollywoodization of the Dalai Lama in Tibet actually hurt their case? Because it's not this idyllic place. It never really was. And so, there's this expectation of the Dalai Lama and what, Americans and Europeans, they worship something that doesn't exist, never did. And it affects politics.
I think you're right. The Hollywood mystical community is convinced that there was this Shangri-La, a golden age, where everybody lived in harmony with nature, where there was no conflict. And of course, Tibetan history is anything but. The reality we see is a manorial system. In other words, it's something that you had in Western Europe in the Dark Ages, with serfs, about 75% of the population being serfs, maybe 5% actual slaves in households usually, a tiny class, about 200 families controlling 93% of the wealth, maybe 400 or 500 people actually running the society, being the beneficiaries, and a very, very onerous regime. It was a brutal feudal theocracy where the favorite punishments were mutilation of the eye, the hand, the foot, the tongue, and all kinds of travel reporters going to Tibet in the 50s and 60s would report the large presence of people in marketplaces who had their hands or other limbs cut off. So this is what it was. This was not spiritual. This is a myth, essentially, which has appealed to people from Heinrich Himmler, who sent an expedition to Tibet, all the way to Richard Gere and Sharon Stone. And it is simply a myth. And we cannot base the foreign policy of the United States on a myth tinged with mysticism about Shangri-La. And that is, unfortunately, what a very significant group in the Democratic Party wants to do.
Andrew, if I go back to you in Brussels, I mean, it's very interesting, I mean, being a China expert. In your opinion, are the majority of the people in Tibet, do they prefer communist rule, or do they prefer the feudalism that they had under the Dalai Lama before the Chinese army brought it back under Beijing's control? What would you think the choice is?
Well, there is no doubt, as I was saying, that the standards of living are for everyone to see, and especially for those people who lived through the ancient the period of feudalism. I mean, the older people. There was no comparison. As my colleague was saying, it was a lot of cruelties and atrocities committed under the old regime. But on the other hand, the Tibetan people nowadays, because of, again, the rise of a number of other countries in the border, they feel that they have a kind of special identity, and they feel a little bit threatened with the large number of influx of Chinese people. And I would like to refer back to what my colleague was saying about the Hollywoodization of this.
Andrew,
myth.
we're going to go to a short break. We're going to go to a short break.
Right.
When we return, we'll turn to our discussion on the Dalai Lama, China, and U.S. relations. Stay with RT.
A disaster that the world has never seen before. Thousands injured and killed. Millions homeless and in need of help. Can the joint action of the global forces save a little republic? The chronicles of an international rescue operation. Haiti, Chronicles of Inferno on RT.
I had to go shoot a 10-year-old boy over there.
We train them how to kill. We as officers develop the orders for them to kill. But we never explain to them why it's okay. Most people at the point of looking down and time to pull the trigger became conscientious objectors.
I don't remember squeezing the trigger, and I don't remember seeing him go down. All I remember is that we shot at him.
Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
People on the other side are soldiers too. And soldiers do what soldiers do. And they're trying to kill us, we're trying to kill them, and that's just the ugly face of war.
See that enemy dressed in black! See that enemy dressed in black! Got my bayonet in his back! Got my bayonet in his back!
There's nothing honorable in killing. I went to the war zone, and I started seeing how I need to change. And the only way to do that is to not pick up a rifle and kill another person. That's why I'm applying for conscience objector.
Blood flying all around! Blood flying all around! Keep your head up to the ground!
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the role of Tibet in China-U.S. relations. But before, let's have a look at the Russian angle on this issue.
As a significant player on the international stage, Russia officially supports the territorial integrity of the People's Republic of China. In fact, ties between Russia and China are quite close, ranging from economic and political to strong cultural cooperation. And Russian citizens mostly agree with the official position of their government. According to an opinion poll, 12% of Russians rank China first among countries positively disposed to Russia. Venezuela and Germany were chosen by 8%. Another 6% believe Belarus is the only true friend of Russia. The poll also asked Russians which countries, in their opinion, are most unfriendly towards them. 24% cited the United States. 17% said it's Georgia. Thus, for Russians, China seems to be an amicable country that is worthy of cooperation and respect. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you for that. I'd like to go back to Andrew in Brussels. You were talking about the Hollywood strategy and the Dalai Lama. I'd like you to finish up on that point.
Yeah, I think that this is why China is so angry, because China has indeed done a great deal to improve the standards of living of the Tibetan people through all these years, according to the UN Development Indexes. But in spite of that, the West seems to be painting China as a kind of oppressive regime, bringing nothing but misery to the Tibetan people. This is simply
Andrew,
not true.
You bring up a very good Andrew. You bring up a good point there. I mean, but it's civil society in America and in Europe that are saying this all of the time. And what I'm meaning, not real experts. It's just these people that have this illusion about a place. People will send out a website, make a comment, and and they just believe everything they hear and read, and not from authoritative people.
Yeah. Well, this brings me to my second point, which is that the reason for the anger is that there are a lot of the people in the West who haven't been to Tibet, or if they have been to Tibet, they've been there as a tourist or have lived there for a week or at most a couple of months, and they seem to be sort of experts on Tibet and taking up the baton for what is basically a myth. So that's the anger. But on the other hand, the reality, you quite rightly pointed out, that is a civil society, that's the media in the West, and I think that China has got to learn how to address the Western media to put the story in this proper perspective, and also, well, I mean, perhaps take a more relaxed attitude towards some of these comments, which are basically not based on facts.
If I go to Webster in Washington, is this just a soft power issue for China? I mean, they just don't present it as well as they probably should?
Well, we can see from what the U.S. government is doing that the idea of a color revolution in China is never far below the surface. And they'd like to start in Tibet if they could. They might want to start with the World Uyghur Congress in Xinjiang. They'd like to foment all kinds of trouble in Taiwan, although that's not going too well at the time. They're looking at a youth bulge in China, and they figure there might be 20, 30 million young people who are essentially ready to be duped, who think that the U.S. is cool and that what they see on the Internet is reality. And I think Tibet fits into that. Let me just go back, though. The issue of support. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, with his CIA advisors, fomented a violent rebellion against the People's Liberation Army. And what you saw was that the common people did not join in, that the rich aristocrats thought that this was great. Common people didn't go with it. And I think the most eloquent quotation I've seen from a sort of Tibetan man in the street, person in the street, was, I was a serf under the previous regime. I'm not really as free as I'd like to be under China, but I'm a heck of a lot better off than I was as a serf. And I think that's the point, that the Chinese built the first hospital, the first roads, railroad. They abolished slavery, abolished serfdom, abolished feudal dues. There was actually the corvée, like in medieval Europe, that you had to do forced labor for these aristocrats. If they wanted you to go out and transport goods, you had to go and do that. So this was extremely oppressive, and most of that has been gotten rid of. A lot of people in Tibet, I think, would welcome the Dalai Lama if he stuck to religion. But there's always this political overtone. And remember, when you get the Dalai Lama, it's not just a person. It's this court. He's got a gaggle of feudal landowners in northern India. They get $2 million a year from the United States government, a lot more money from George Soros and his foundations. And the idea is that they want to go back. Now, I don't think they really imagine that they could reimpose the manorial system of feudalism, but I think what they would is a very brutal shock therapy, a shock therapy for Tibet.
Webster, it's very interesting is because the Dalai Lama has wrapped himself up in the flag of democracy lately, but still given its very long history with CIA support, covert support. I mean, there are people that are coming out of around the Dalai Lama, people that are more discouraged, saying this is just a frontier. And I'd like to go to Andrew about that. I mean, has the Dalai Lama just adopted democracy just to appeal to his Western friends and fundraisers?
Well, certainly there was not much democracy, when the Dalai Lama was in power in Tibet, before the Chinese came. But on the other hand, this is resonate with, as you say, the civil society in the West. But I'd like to come back to the kind of the dilemma China is facing. On the one hand, the Dalai Lama was saying, I'm not advocating independence. But on the other hand, he is not able to control some of the hawks or deliberately allow some of his hawkish followers to agitate for independence. And this is fueled also by the kind of media reporting in the West as if this is a movement for democracy in Tibet. So this is a very worrying thing and quite unfortunate. But I think that the Chinese government has to address the media better as to put the things in the proper perspective.
Okay, I'd like to turn to a comment made by Dennis Blair, of the Director of National Intelligence. This is a description of how he believes the Chinese see Washington's activities in its own backyard. Let's give him a hear.
Beijing still believes that the United States seeks to contain it, to transform its society, and that reinforces their concerns about internal stability, about perceived challenges to their sovereignty claims. China continues to increase its defense spending. Preparations for a Taiwan conflict involving a U.S. intervention continues to dominate their modernization and their contingency plans, and they're also increasingly concerned about how to protect their global interests.
Webster, I'd like to turn to you on this point here because there's a lot of truth in what we just heard there. I mean, it's the United States still treats China as a country it can tell what to do. You have to do this. We want you to listen to us about our concerns with Tibet, our concerns with Taiwan. And now the Chinese are turning around saying, no, you listen to us about our concerns, turning it around.
This Blair is a very, very unfortunate guy. When you look at Chinese history, you look at the history of unequal treaties and the 3 Opium Wars and the rest of this, there's a great sensitivity, which I think we have to understand. It's not just the dozen issues, right? The various Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, South China Sea, Google, human rights. There's also the fact that what the U.S. does under the cover of this cynical slogan of the global war on terror, the U.S. wants to attack Iran. There's the idea of moving the Afghan civil war into Pakistan. Why is that? It's because the hope of China is to get an overland guaranteed safe oil route. So the oil would come from Iran, the pipeline would go through Pakistan, and look, this is exactly what the U.S. is attacking. Same thing goes for Sudan, where the Chinese get oil, Zimbabwe, where they get minerals, the string of pearls across the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Bangladesh, all countries friendly to China are all under military or diplomatic or economic attack by the United States. So in reality, the whole U.S. foreign policy is keyed to this containing of Chinese economic relations. And it's an index of the bankruptcy of the U.S., that the U.S. can't compete in economics anymore, so they try to do it with geopolitics, fomenting conflicts, subversion, color revolutions, and all the rest of this. And, of course, this is a feckless and losing strategy, and the elites in the United States had better think again, because this will not get them anywhere.
Andrew, would you like to respond to that? Because it seems like, the rhetoric is that that the United States needs to work with its this growing superpower in the world. But if we listen to Webster, and I quite agree with him, the United States is just going to make the world very, very difficult for the Chinese to emerge into as a partner.
Well, in fact, the National Intelligence Council Report 2025 already highlighted the fact that there is no doubt that America would continue to lead, but the capacity to lead is declining because of either morally but also militarily and financially all around the world. But there is a kind of backlash in the thinking in America, saying that, well, after all, I mean, we are the biggest economy in the world, and Americans' military strength is unparalleled. We can still exert this influence, but without realizing that the world is much more interdependent. And of course, China is not is way, way behind America in terms of military strength. But in the world of global interdependence, America relies on China for all this investment in the U.S. treasuries and a number of theaters around the world. America needs China as much China needs America. So this kind of Cold War mentality, I don't think it would be in anybody's interest, and it may not, in the long run, achieve the best interest for America.
Webster, if I go back to you, you'll have the last word here. Cold War mentality, that's what Andrew said. I think it's very well put. What's it going to take for the United States to start changing its attitude towards China and actually really treating it as a partner, or we just have to have a crisis of one sort or another for that to happen?
It's a Cold War mentality and it's hegemonism, and both of these are not going to work well. The most extreme form of this China phobia that I found here in Washington is a study commissioned by the Pentagon Office of Net Assessment from the Hudson Institute. It's called The Great Siberian War of 2025. And the idea is the U.S. has succeeded in cutting off Chinese access to oil in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf. And therefore, the idea is that at that point, China, in desperation, turns to Siberia, Russia, east of the Urals, and you get a world war based on the conflict of Russia and China over that oil.
Webster,
that is where this is leading unless they change, and I hope they will.
We started out with the Dalai Lama, and I hope we're not ending on the Third World War. I want to thank our guests today, Webster Tarpley and Andrew Leung, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here on RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.